The corner griddle was an institution built on the fragile foundation of routine. Ayanna was an essential part of that foundation, a human cornerstone in a world of chipped formica and lukewarm coffee. The diner was a living entity with its own circadian rhythm, a slow, mournful heartbeat that pulsed from sunrise to sundown. In the morning, it was the symphony of the breakfast rush, the sizzling of bacon, the insistent hiss of the coffee machine, the staccato chorus of plates and cutlery. In the afternoon, it subsided into a quiet, introspective hum, the kind of stillness that let the ghosts of 1,000 forgotten conversations linger in the stale air. Ayanna was not just a waitress. She was the quiet keeper of this rhythm, a silent observer in a world she had intentionally chosen for its predictable, suffocating normalcy. Her uniform, a simple white shirt and black apron, was a shroud she wore to bury a past that refused to stay dead. Underneath a different person resided a woman forged in a crucible of sandstorms and sacrifice. The strength in her hands, the subtle alertness in her eyes, the efficient economy of her movements, these were all relics of a life she no longer lived. To the regulars, she was Ayanna, the quiet waitress with the kind, distant eyes. They didn't see the finely tuned weapon of a woman who could without a moment's hesitation drop to a knee and sight a target with lethal accuracy. They never noticed the way her gaze would occasionally drift to the window, scanning the street with an unconscious vigilance, a habit ingrained by years of watching for threats on a far more dangerous horizon. Ayanna was a master of camouflage, a wolf in sheep's clothing, and this diner was her forest. The morning took a turn from the ordinary when a young mother and her 2 children entered. The family was a living portrait of quiet hardship. The mother's coat, a thin, worn-out affair, was buttoned to the neck against a cold that had long since settled into her bones. Her purse, an imitation leather bag, was held together by a prayer and a single loose thread. Ayanna's omniscient gaze caught the children's eyes, the boys wide and filled with the innocent hunger of a child who understands scarcity. The girls older and wiser holding a shared burden of worry with her mother. The mother's face, etched with a quiet, weary dignity, was a sight Ayanna knew all too well. It was the face of a person fighting a war for which there were no medals, no parades, and no glory, just survival. The other waitresses busy with the morning rush gave the family a cursory glance. To them, it was just another table, another set of orders. But to Ayanna, it was a mirror. She remembered her own mother, her hands raw and chapped from work counting pennies at the kitchen table late at night, the fear of not having enough, a constant presence in their small, cold apartment. She remembered the gnawing emptiness in her stomach, the hollow ache that no amount of courage could fill. She had escaped that life had fought her way out with sheer will and a talent that had been honed to a razor's edge. And here in this booth was a living reminder of the life she had left behind. The mother, her voice, a near inaudible whisper, ordered for her family. "Just 2 oatmeals and a coffee for me, please." Ayanna simply nodded, her expression unreadable. She walked to the kitchen, the order a whisper in her mind, but her thoughts were consumed by the mother's quiet despair. She saw the boy's eyes fixated on a neighboring table where a man devoured a mountain of pancakes and a side of crispy bacon. Ayanna's heart tightened, a silent knot of empathy and anger. It was an anger not at the man, but at the world that could be so abundant for some and so cruelly scarce for others. As she served the oatmeal, she made a quiet promise to herself. She served the mother her coffee, the mug warm in her cold hands, a small comfort in a world that offered so few. The mother drank her coffee slowly, her hands wrapped around the mug, as if drawing warmth and courage from its ceramic shell. The children ate their oatmeal, their movements slow and deliberate, savoring every spoonful. When the time came to pay, the mother fumbled in her purse, her cheeks flushing crimson with a mortifying shame. She pulled out a small crumpled wad of bills, a 5, a 2, and a few dollars in coins. She was short. Her dignity, a fragile thing she held so dear, was about to be broken. I am so sorry," she stammered, her eyes darting nervously around the room as if afraid to be judged. "I promise I'll be back to pay the rest." Ayanna, watching from behind the counter, felt the old instincts dormant for so long surge to life. It was the instinct to protect the vulnerable, to act when others would stand by and watch. She remembered the sound of a team member's voice over the radio, a desperate plea for help from a downed chopper. She remembered the quiet resolve in her own heart as she flew into a hail of fire to answer that call. This was no different. The battle was quieter. The stakes seemed smaller, but to this mother, this was her everything. Without a second thought, Ayanna took her own card from her wallet, an old card, a forgotten artifact from a life of military paychecks and combat bonuses. She swiped it, the machine whirring a quiet, indifferent tune. The receipt printed a simple piece of paper that held the power to restore a woman's dignity. She walked back to the booth, her face a serene mask. "Everything's taken care of," she said quietly, her voice firm yet gentle. "On the house." The mother's eyes, wide with disbelief, filled with tears. "Ayanna, I just can't accept this." Ayanna smiled, a real, genuine smile that reached her weary eyes. "There's nothing to accept. It's just a small kindness. The world is full of them, we just have to remember to look. All I ask is that someday when you're able, you do the same for someone else." The mother's tearful nod was her silent promise, a vow to carry Ayanna's small act of grace forward into her own life. As the family left, the boy turned and gave Ayanna a small, shy wave, a gesture of pure, unburdened gratitude. Ayanna felt a profound sense of peace settle over her, a feeling she had not known since she had traded her uniform for an apron. For a moment, she was not just a waitress. She was a protector, a rescuer, a force for good. She was herself again. As the afternoon waned into evening and the diner's heartbeat slowed to a quiet, contemplative hum, Ayanna found herself in the quiet sanctuary of the back room. Her mind, no longer occupied with orders and refills, drifted to the ghost that lived in her own skin, the indelible mark of a life she had been forced to abandon. She ran her thumb over the thick, jagged scar on her right forearm. It was not a faint line, but a proud, twisted seam of flesh, a testament to a wound that had nearly taken her life and had ultimately changed the course of it forever. She closed her eyes, and the memory, a series of fragmented but vivid images, bloomed in her mind. It was a scorching day in the unforgiving deserts of Afghanistan. The air, thick with the smell of sand and diesel fuel, was hot enough to melt bone. Ayanna, call sign Vixen, was strapped into the jump seat of a Pavehawk helicopter, the thudding roar of the rotors a constant comforting presence. Her team, her brothers and sisters in arms, were a sea of camouflage and grim resolve. Their mission was simple in its complexity: fly into a hot zone, rescue a downed Special Forces team, and fly back out. The mission had gone sideways, as missions often do. They had been hit not by small arms fire, but by something more catastrophic, an IED. The world had erupted into a blinding white flash of light and a deafening, bone-shattering concussion. She remembered the searing, white-hot pain that had consumed her right side, the feeling of her world coming apart. She remembered the guttural roar of the helicopter as it spiraled downwards, the frantic shouts of her team, and the metallic tang of blood in her mouth. She had seen her own blood, a grotesque red blooming on the pristine desert sand. She had felt the frantic hands of her medic, his face a mask of grim determination, as he worked to save her, his voice a distant echo over the frantic shouts of her team. The scar was the physical manifestation of that day, a map of a battlefield carved into her very being. It was the weight of the lives she had saved, the lives she had lost, and the life she had been forced to leave behind. She had chosen this life of quiet servitude, of anonymity, to escape the haunted halls of her past. But in the quiet moments, the ghost of Vixen would not stay buried. The bell above the door jangled a final jarring note in the diner's symphony. An elderly man, thin and stooped, walked in and took a seat at a table by the window. He was a new face, a stranger to Ayanna. Yet as she walked over, she felt a strange, inexplicable sense of familiarity. He wore a simple cap embroidered with a small, faded anchor, the symbol of the U.S. Navy. His face was a roadmap of a hard-lived life, his eyes a faded blue that held the distant, haunted look of a man who had seen too much. He didn't ask for a menu. Instead, his gaze, full of an unsettling wisdom, fell upon her. He watched her approach, and his eyes, a silent, knowing pair, fixed on her right arm. The sleeve of her uniform was pushed up, a habit she had developed to keep it from getting stained. The scar, a silent scream of a past life, was on full display. The old man's face, which had been a mask of quiet contemplation, changed. A flicker of recognition, sharp and instantaneous, crossed his features. He didn't say a word, didn't give any other indication. but his eyes full of a deep, silent understanding met hers, and in that moment, Ayanna knew. He didn't see a waitress. He saw a fellow soldier. A ghost just like her. The last peaceful beat of her old life had just ended and the storm was about to begin. The quiet hum of the corner griddle was abruptly shattered by the belligerent jangle of the service bell. Ayanna, who had been refilling the sugar caddy, looked up to see a man swagger into the diner as if he owned it. He was a caricature of a certain type of privilege, a man named Sterling, with an expensive watch, a meticulously coiffed shock of gray hair, and a sneering superiority that seemed to precede him like a cloud of smog. He was flanked by a younger man and a woman who seemed to share his air of entitlement, albeit with a less practiced arrogance. They chose a booth by the window, the very one where Ayanna had seen the young mother find a moment of grace just a few hours earlier. Ayanna felt an immediate, visceral recoil. It was an instinctual warning, a silent alarm bell that had been fine-tuned in far more dangerous places than this diner. This man was not just a difficult customer, he was a problem. The veteran Sam, sitting at his table by the window, watched the group enter his faded blue eyes, narrowing just a fraction. He had seen men like this before, men who wielded their power like a weapon, whose contempt for others was as natural as breathing. He watched as Ayanna, ever the professional, approached their table, her notepad and pen ready. "Good afternoon, welcome to the Corner Griddle. Can I get you started with some drinks?" Ayanna's voice was as smooth and calm as ever, a practiced melody of professional courtesy. Sterling's sneer deepened. He looked Ayanna up and down, his eyes lingering for a moment too long. "I'll have a coffee. And not one of those watered-down diner concoctions you people call coffee. Bring me a real strong cup. And make sure you get it right." He didn't even look at the menu. The contempt was not just in his words, but in the way he spoke them, as if he were addressing a piece of furniture that had the audacity to speak back. Ayanna's hands, hidden behind her back, clenched into fists. Ayanna, the former combat rescue officer, the woman who had stared down a 1,000-yard stare from a Taliban fighter, now stood silently enduring the casual racism of a man whose biggest struggle was probably deciding which vintage wine to order. The fury was a hot, molten river in her veins, but she dammed it with years of discipline. She needed this job. The fear of being unable to pay her bills, of losing the fragile normalcy she had built, was a far more potent inhibitor than any threat on a battlefield. Her professional mask was a fortress, and she would not let it crumble. "I'll see what I can do," she replied, her voice still impossibly calm. She took the other orders and turned away, the silent sting of his words a burning ember in her mind. As she walked back to the kitchen, she felt his eyes on her back, a physical weight of judgment and disdain. The other waitstaff saw only a demanding customer. Ayanna saw a predator. She brought the drinks a fresh pot of coffee and set it down. Sterling picked up the mug, sniffed it with a look of theatrical disgust, and took a long, exaggerated sip. "This is a joke," he said, pushing the mug away. "Are you even capable of making a decent cup of coffee? Or is this all you people know how to do?" His voice, though not loud, carried a malicious edge that made the nearby tables go quiet. Ayanna's jaw tightened. She had to remind herself to breathe, to keep her face impassive. Her old life had a simple code: neutralize the threat. But here, the threat was intangible, a poison of words and prejudice that she was powerless to fight with a weapon or a tactical maneuver. This was a different kind of war, a war of attrition, and she was losing ground with every passing moment. "I can get you another one, sir," she said, her voice a low murmur. "No, I think I've had enough of your incompetence," Sterling said, leaning back in his seat, a cruel smile playing on his lips. "Why don't you just get me a menu and let someone else take over? I'm sure someone here can actually do their job." Ayanna's world, her quiet, carefully constructed world of routine and anonymity, was crumbling. The urge to respond, to lash out, to tell this man exactly who he was and what she was capable of, was almost overwhelming. The dormant beast within her, the one she had locked away after leaving the service, was stirring. But she held it back. She looked at the faces of her colleagues, their expressions a mix of pity and fear. She knew that if she responded, she would be out of a job. She would lose the fragile stability that had taken her years to build. She would be homeless, a ghost with no place to haunt. She simply nodded, her eyes downcast. "I understand. I'll get the manager for you." As she turned to walk away, A cold, hard voice from within her mind whispered, "This is not what you were made for, Ayanna. This is not who you are." But Sterling wasn't done. He stood up, blocking her path, his face a mask of patronizing amusement. "Wait, you look like a hard worker. I'm sure you're very good at other things." He reached out his hand, wrapping around her forearm. It was a gesture meant to assert dominance, to intimidate. In a flash, Ayanna's trained reflexes took over. Her muscles tensed, her body prepared to react. She saw the scene from an aerial view. Her the man, the shocked faces of the other diners. She saw the inevitable conclusion, a physical altercation, a call to the police, the loss of her job, the end of her new life. A split second before she could react, her sleeve, which had been rolled up to her elbow, was caught by Sterling's hand and pulled down. Her skin was exposed, and with it the long, jagged, pale scar that ran from her wrist to her elbow. The scar was not just a mark. It was a story, a testament to a life lived on the edge of oblivion. And then the world went quiet. Not a metaphorical quiet, but a sudden, abrupt silence that descended upon the diner. Sterling froze, his cruel smile melting into a look of confusion. He stared at the scar, a mark so out of place on the arm of a simple waitress, and a flicker of doubt crossed his features. But he had no time to process it. From his booth by the window, the veteran Sam had been watching the scene with a cold, detached fury. He saw the condescension, the humiliation, and now the physical intimidation. He had served in a different branch in a different time, but the code was the same. You do not stand by and watch a fellow soldier, a fellow human being, be treated with such flagrant disrespect. He stood up, his frame surprisingly tall and solid for his age, and walked over to the table. He didn't need to see the entire scar. He saw enough. He saw the color, the texture, the intricate twisted pattern of the skin that had been stitched back together by a military surgeon. He had seen that scar 100 times before on 100 different soldiers. It was the mark of a combat wound. It was the mark of a hero. "That's enough." Sam's voice was low and gravelly, but it cut through the silence like a knife. He stood between Sterling and Ayanna, his body a silent, immovable wall. "Leave her alone." Sterling, taken aback by the sudden intervention, turned his sneer on Sam. "Who are you? Stay out of this, old man. This is none of your business." But Sam didn't back down. He simply stood there, a quiet, unyielding presence. He knew who Ayanna was, not just from the scar, but from the way she held herself, the way her eyes, despite her fear, held a deep, unshakable strength. This was the moment, the catalyst. The moment Ayanna's quiet world would be broken forever. The moment her past would collide with her present in a devastating and undeniable way. Sam's intervention had saved her from a physical altercation, but it had also set in motion a series of events that would force her to confront the ghosts she had been so desperately trying to outrun. The die had been cast, and there was no going back. The air in the corner griddle, moments ago filled with the gentle hum of lunchtime chatter, had been replaced by a silence so profound it was deafening. It was a silence born of shock, a quiet vacuum left in the wake of Sterling's brazen cruelty. The veteran Sam stood like an unmoving sentinel, his back to Ayanna, a silent but formidable barrier between her and the man who sought to humiliate her. Ayanna, her hand still frozen in place where Sterling's grip had been felt, the full weight of the moment. The fortress she had built around her life of anonymity had not just been breached. A giant gaping hole had been torn into it. The scar, her most guarded secret, was now on display for a stranger to see. Sterling's sneer had evaporated, replaced by a look of baffled fury. He hadn't expected a challenge, especially not from an old man in a threadbare navy cap. "Get out of my way, old man," he snarled, his voice a low, venomous hiss. "This is none of your business." His companions, a younger man and woman, who had until now been silent witnesses to his display, shifted uncomfortably in their seats, their faces a mixture of embarrassment and trepidation. They were not accustomed to seeing Sterling, their de facto leader, challenged in such a public and definitive manner. Sam didn't flinch. He didn't raise his voice or make a threatening gesture. Instead, he met Sterling's furious gaze with a calm, unwavering stare that was far more intimidating than any physical threat. "The moment you put your hands on her, you made it my business," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. "I've seen your type before. All bluster and no backbone. You want to pick a fight. Pick one with someone who can fight back." His words were not a threat. They were a simple statement of fact, a promise backed by a lifetime of hard-won experience. Ayanna, her heart thudding a frantic rhythm against her ribs, finally moved. She stepped out from behind Sam, not with a burst of defiance, but with a quiet, controlled purpose. She knew the moment had come. The carefully constructed persona of the quiet waitress was a luxury she could no longer afford. She had to take control not with violence, but with the one weapon she still possessed: her discipline. She met Sterling's eyes, her own, a steady, unyielding stare. The look of fear and subservience that he had come to expect was gone, replaced by a cold, sharp intelligence he had never seen before. It was the look of a predator assessing a threat. "Sir, I am going to ask you to leave," Ayanna said, her voice clear and impossibly calm, devoid of any emotion. It was the voice of a commander giving a final order, a voice she had not used in years. She took a small tactical step to her left, placing herself between Sterling and Sam, her body a shield, her mind already calculating escape routes and potential threats. It was an instinct so deeply ingrained that she acted without thinking, a reflex born of countless hours of training. She didn't flinch when Sterling's face, mottled with fury, loomed inches from hers. "You're going to ask me, who do you think you are?" Sterling sneered, his voice shaking with impotent rage. "You're a dime a dozen waitress in a greasy spoon. You're nothing." His words were meant to cut, to diminish her, but Ayanna didn't hear them. Her mind was a quiet, focused machine. She had faced down far greater threats than this, threats that carried far more weight than this man's arrogance. She looked not at his eyes, but at his posture, the slight tremor in his hand, the way he was breathing. She saw his fear, a deep-seated terror of being exposed and humiliated in a public setting. He was not a threat. He was a liability, a bully whose power was built on the assumption that no one would dare to challenge him. Ayanna leaned in slightly, her voice dropping to a low, intense murmur that only he could hear. It was a tactical maneuver, a way to isolate the threat and assert control. "You're making a scene," she whispered. "This isn't good for your brand, is it? The public humiliation of a man who thinks he's untouchable. You should go now, before you make things worse." Her words were a scalpel cutting through his bluster and getting to the heart of his fear. It was a psychological attack, a show of force far more powerful than any punch could have been. Sterling's jaw dropped. The sheer audacity, the calm, collected confidence of this woman, this waitress, was a shock to his system. He looked at her, then at Sam, and then at the shocked faces of the other diners. The public humiliation, once a weapon he had intended to use against Ayanna, had now been turned against him. His face a mask of red-hot fury, twisted with the agony of defeat. He shoved past Sam, nearly knocking him off balance, and stormed out of the diner without another word, his companions scrambling to follow him. The door slammed shut with a final echoing bang. The silence that followed was a different kind of quiet. It was a silence of awe, of disbelief, of the lingering tension of a storm that had just passed. The other diners, their conversations forgotten, stared at Ayanna, their faces a canvas of confusion and respect. They had seen a different side of her, a raw, unyielding strength that had been hidden beneath her quiet demeanor. Sam, his face unreadable, finally turned to Ayanna. He looked at her not with gratitude, but with an intense, knowing scrutiny. He saw the way she held herself, the way her eyes, still sharp and focused, were scanning the room for secondary threats. He saw the coiled tension in her muscles, the readiness that still lingered in her frame. He had seen that look 100 times before, in 100 different barracks and bunkers. It was the look of a soldier who had just left the battlefield, but hadn't yet come home. "You're not a waitress," he said, his voice quiet, a simple statement of fact. "Not really." He gestured to her forearm, to the scar that was still visible. "That's not from a kitchen knife. I know what that is. You're a hero, aren't you?" Ayanna, the mask she had worn for so long now shattered, felt a wave of cold dread wash over her. It was the dread of discovery, of her carefully guarded secrets being laid bare. She looked at Sam, this kind stranger who had just come to her aid, and saw in his eyes a deep, genuine recognition. He was not a threat. He was a kindred spirit. He was an ally. The realization was a shock to her system, a feeling of both profound relief and overwhelming terror. But the confrontation was not over. The omniscient perspective, a privilege of the narrative, now followed Sterling. He had stumbled out of the diner, his face a contorted mask of fury and humiliation. He got into his expensive car and slammed the door shut, the sound echoing his rage. His two companions, now silent and fearful, looked at him with apprehension. "Did you see that?" He spat, his voice a furious whisper. "That girl. That stupid, stuck-up waitress. Who does she think she is?" His rage was not just a passing emotion, it was a festering wound to his ego. He, a man of power and influence, had been humiliated by an old man and a waitress. The insult was unbearable. It was not just about the coffee or the disrespect. It was about her defiance, her refusal to be intimidated. It was about the cold, hard stare she had given him, a stare that had stripped him bare and left him feeling small and impotent. He was not just angry. He was consumed by a desire for revenge. He pulled out his phone, his fingers trembling with rage. "You know what to do," he snapped into the receiver. "Find out everything you can about a waitress named Ayanna who works at the corner griddle. I want her social security number, her background, her entire life history. I want to know where she came from, who her family is. I want to know what makes a girl like that think she can talk to me that way. And when you find out, I want her life to become a living hell." He hung up the phone, his breathing ragged. He looked in his rearview mirror and saw his own face, a bloated, ugly mask of hatred and petty vengeance. He had just declared war not on a woman, but on a ghost. A ghost that had just been forced to come back to life. Meanwhile, back in the quiet sanctuary of the diner, Sam and Ayanna stood in a profound, understanding silence. The other diners were slowly returning to their meals, their conversations resuming in hushed tones, but the atmosphere had changed forever. "I didn't think anyone would ever know," Ayanna said, her voice barely a whisper. The mask was off. The fortress was gone. She felt a vulnerability she had not experienced in years, a raw, exposed feeling of being seen for who she truly was. Sam, with a gentle, fatherly smile, simply nodded. "Some scars, they tell a story," he said, his eyes a distant, hazy blue. "And some stories, they just can't be hidden forever." "You were a medic, weren't you?" Ayanna's eyes widened slightly. "Combat rescue officer," she corrected softly, the words feeling strange and unfamiliar on her tongue. The title, once a source of immense pride, now felt like a heavy burden. "I was Navy," Sam said, a nostalgic smile playing on his lips. "Different world, different war, but the code's the same. You don't leave your people behind, and you don't let a man like that walk all over you." He reached out and gently patted her shoulder, a gesture of camaraderie that felt more real and more genuine than any civilian contact she had had in years. "My name's Sam, and you've got a friend now, Ayanna. Looks like you're going to need one." Ayanna, feeling a tear roll down her cheek, simply nodded, the full weight of the moment settling in her heart. She had tried so hard to escape her past, to bury her identity, but in the end, it had come for her. It had found her in this diner, in this small, insignificant corner of the world. And now, thanks to a bully's rage and a kind old veteran's intervention, she was no longer alone. She had a friend, and she had an enemy. The two worlds she had worked so hard to keep separate had finally collided, and there was no going back. Sterling's rage, a venomous, festering wound to his oversized ego, was not a passing fancy. It was a fire that burned with a cold, singular intensity. The humiliation of being defied by a mere waitress in front of a diner full of strangers and his own associates was an insult his psyche could not process. In his world, people like Ayanna were background noise, nameless servants whose existence was to facilitate his comfort and never to question his authority. Her calm defiance, the cold, sharp intelligence in her eyes, had been an attack on the very foundation of his reality. He had been stripped bare, made to feel impotent and small, and now, fueled by a corrosive need for vengeance, he was setting in motion a plan to destroy her. He would not just fire her, he would break her. He would not just ruin her reputation, he would dismantle the very core of her being. From his opulent office, a sterile monument to his self-importance, he began his hunt. The phone call he made was not to the police or a lawyer, but to a network of contacts he had cultivated over a lifetime of ruthless ambition. He pulled strings, made promises, and traded favors, his rage a tangible presence in the room. He wanted a name, a record, a history. He wanted to know everything about this woman who dared to challenge him. The information, when it came, was a slow, deliberate leak from the deep, labyrinthine databases of the government. Sterling, a man who saw military service as a playground for the privileged, read through the files with a growing sense of shock and malevolent glee. Ayanna, formerly senior airman, Ayanna Jakes, a combat rescue officer. The files detailed her commendations, her selfless acts of bravery, and the mission that had nearly cost her life, the IED blast, the severe injuries, the honorable discharge. Sterling read every word, his sneer returning, but this time it was laced with a chilling, predatory focus. He saw not a hero, but a weakness. He saw a wound he could exploit. The waitress was not just a waitress. She was a disgraced soldier, a broken veteran clinging to a forgotten life. This was his opportunity. He would not just defeat her, he would make her defeat a public spectacle, a lesson for anyone who dared to stand in his way. He would use her own history, her own heroism as the very tool of her destruction. Meanwhile, in the quiet, unassuming sanctuary of the corner griddle, Ayanna's world had become one of nervous whispers and guarded glances. The story of her confrontation with Sterling had spread like wildfire. The other waitresses treated her with a new hesitant respect, but their fear was palpable. They knew Sterling was a powerful man, a bully who could ruin lives, and they worried for her. Ayanna, for her part, was not afraid of the man, but of what his discovery of her past could mean. Her fragile peace was gone, and she felt a deep existential dread of being forced back into a world she had so desperately tried to leave behind. Sam, however, was a constant, solid presence in her life. He came to the diner every day, not for the food, but for her. He would sit at his booth nursing a single cup of coffee, his quiet, knowing gaze a source of immense comfort. He was a beacon of sanity in her swirling world of anxiety. He saw past the waitress and saw the soldier, a kindred spirit, a person who understood the weight of a life lived for others. He was the first person in years to truly see her. A man like that doesn't just let things go, Sam said one afternoon, his voice a low, gravelly murmur. He'll be looking for a way to get back at you. Not just to fire you, but to make you wish you'd never met him. Ayanna, wiping down a counter, nodded grimly. She knew it in her bones. She had seen the look in Sterling's eyes, the cold, calculating fury of a man whose pride was more important than his humanity. She had faced down similar men on the battlefield, men who would stop at nothing to win. But this was a different kind of war, a war of manipulation and social standing, and Ayanna, a warrior without a weapon, felt a profound sense of helplessness. A week after the confrontation, the other shoe dropped. The news came not through a threatening phone call or a legal letter, but through a city-wide announcement plastered on billboards and television screens. Sterling, a major player in the city's real estate and charity circles, was sponsoring the annual Veterans Valor Games. It was a new event he claimed, a celebration of the city's military heroes. The centerpiece of the event was a rescue challenge, a timed single-elimination obstacle course designed to simulate a real-life combat rescue mission. The prize was a substantial cash donation to a veterans charity of the winner's choice. Ayanna's name, however, was emblazoned on every poster framed as the star contestant. Ayanna Jakes, the city's newest hero. The posters proclaimed with a nauseating hypocrisy. Ayanna's blood ran cold. She saw the trap for what it was. This was his arena, his symbolic stage for her public humiliation. It was a challenge designed to highlight her past, her military service, and her injury. He was forcing her to compete, to put herself on display, knowing that she was an injured veteran who had not been in active service for years. He was framing it as a charity event, to make it impossible for her to refuse without looking cowardly or ungrateful. He was using her own honor against her. She was torn. The fear of public humiliation of her past being exposed to the world was a heavy weight on her soul. But the thought of letting a man like Sterling win, of letting him use her story as a weapon, was an insult to everything she had ever believed in. She was a soldier. She had a duty to herself, to her honor, to the men and women she had once fought alongside. That evening, as she sat with Sam nursing a lukewarm coffee, he spoke to her with a quiet, knowing intensity. He's not just challenging you, Ayanna. He's challenging what you stand for. He's challenging the idea that a person's worth is more than what they can do for him. You can't let him win. Ayanna looked at her hands. The hands that had once saved lives, now scarred and calloused from years of washing dishes. She thought of her past, of the woman she had been, a woman who never backed down from a challenge. She thought of the young mother she had helped, the silent gratitude in her eyes. It was a new kind of duty, a different kind of mission. She had to fight not just for herself, but for the principle of the thing. She had to show the world that honor, dignity, and courage were not things that could be bought, sold, or broken by a man like Sterling. "I'll do it," she said, her voice low and steady. The words once spoken felt like a great weight being lifted from her shoulders. The fear was still there, but now it was overshadowed by a quiet, burning resolve. The weeks leading up to the Valor Games were a blur of intense solitary training. Ayanna, with Sam acting as her quiet, unyielding coach, began to reawaken her dormant skills. She ran along the winding back roads, her legs once powerful and tireless, protesting with every step. She trained in a dusty old gym, her muscles screaming with a pain she had not felt in years. She practiced her combat rescue techniques in an old abandoned warehouse, her movements rusty but still precise. Her old injury, the jagged scar on her arm, was a constant throbbing reminder of her vulnerability. She pushed herself to the breaking point and beyond, knowing that the man Sterling had hired would be younger, stronger, and more experienced. And Sterling had indeed hired a professional. His name was Marcus Thorne, a young, arrogant former Special Forces soldier who had a reputation for being a ruthless competitor. Thorne, a Type A character driven by a desire for fame and fortune, had been promised a sizable sum to publicly humiliate Ayanna. He saw her not as a fellow soldier, but as an easy target, a washed-up veteran who had no business competing in a physical challenge. He was a mirror image of Sterling, a younger, more physically capable version of the bully who had set this entire debacle in motion. On the eve of the competition, the town square was a hub of activity, a buzzing arena of anticipation. Banners with Sterling's face and the words "Veterans Valor Games" hung from every lamppost. The obstacle course, a terrifying monstrosity of climbing walls, rope swings, and rescue simulations, loomed in the center of the square, a silent challenge under the unforgiving glare of floodlights. Ayanna, standing on the edge of the course, felt the familiar surge of adrenaline that had once defined her life. Her heart pounded, her muscles were coiled with tension, and her mind was a quiet, focused void. She was not a waitress anymore. She was a soldier preparing for a mission. Sam stood beside her, a quiet, reassuring presence. He didn't speak. He just gave her a slow, knowing nod, a look that said, "I believe in you." She looked across the square and saw Sterling flanked by Marcus Thorne, his face a smug, triumphant mask. He was a man who had already declared victory, a man who saw her not as a person, but as an obstacle to be crushed. The announcer's voice boomed over the loudspeakers, a theatrical, over-the-top pronouncement. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are just moments away from the first heat of the Veterans Valor Games. On the course we have our hometown hero Ayanna Jakes, facing off against the formidable Marcus Thorne." Ayanna took a deep breath, the night air cool and crisp in her lungs. She looked at her arm, at the jagged scar, and for the first time in years, she felt not shame or dread, but a profound, unyielding sense of pride. This scar was not a sign of a broken life. It was a badge of honor. It was a story of survival, of courage, of a life lived with purpose. She was not just fighting for herself. She was fighting for her past, for her honor, for the quiet dignity of 1,000 forgotten heroes. The starting gun was about to fire. The timer was about to start. The test of her life was about to begin. She was alone, but she was not broken. She was ready. The air in the town square was thick with a palpable tension, a mixture of cynical anticipation and genuine curiosity. The Valor Games were more than a competition. They were a spectacle, a public trial for Ayanna. The massive, intimidating obstacle course loomed under the unforgiving glare of floodlights, a monument to Sterling's malicious design. The crowd, a sea of faces that Ayanna recognized from her quiet life patrons from the diner. The indifferent cook, even the young mother she had helped, a small, hopeful smile on her face, was a silent jury. They had come to watch, to judge, and to see if the rumors of Ayanna's quiet strength were just a myth. On the starting line, Ayanna stood beside Marcus Thorne, the man Sterling had hired to ensure her humiliation. Marcus was a physical marvel, a younger, stronger version of Ayanna, a man whose body had not yet been broken by the brutal realities of war. He was a picture of arrogant confidence, stretching his muscles with theatrical flair, his eyes a cold, calculating blue. He looked at Ayanna not as a competitor but as an obstacle to his paycheck, a forgotten relic he was about to put out of his misery. Ayanna, by contrast, was a study in stillness. Her face was a mask of granite, her eyes a focused void, her body coiled with a taut, simmering energy. The scar on her right arm, now a symbol of her defiance, was on full display, a silent promise of the pain she was willing to endure. The announcer's voice, a theatrical bark, boomed over the loudspeakers. "Contestants on your marks, get set, go." The starting gun fired with a deafening crack. Marcus, with a sprinter's explosive power, was off the line in a flash. He vaulted over the first low wall, his movements fluid and effortless, a human machine designed for this kind of contest. Ayanna, her movements more deliberate and controlled, followed closely behind. She was not as fast, her muscles protesting with a familiar searing ache. Her old injury, the jagged scar on her arm, was already a throbbing, relentless drumbeat of pain. Marcus, with a smug, condescending smile, pulled ahead, putting a significant distance between them. The crowd murmured, their initial skepticism confirmed. They had come to see a hero, and all they saw was an aging waitress struggling to keep up with a professional. Sterling, watching from a VIP platform, let a triumphant smile spread across his face. This was going exactly as he had planned. He had not only secured his victory, he had already begun the public humiliation of the woman who had dared to defy him. Ayanna was not just losing. She was being made to look slow, old, and weak. The course was a gauntlet of punishing obstacles. Ayanna climbed a rope ladder, her hands once calloused from years of gripping a rifle and a hoist, now trembling with a strain they hadn't known in years. She swung across a series of monkey bars, the pain in her injured arm a fire that threatened to consume her. She ran a gauntlet of tires, her feet, once sure-footed in the chaos of a battlefield, now feeling heavy and leaden. Marcus, meanwhile, was a blur of speed and efficiency, his every movement a testament to his youth and training. He was already at the final obstacle, a terrifyingly difficult climb to the top of a simulated rock wall, where a dummy representing a downed soldier waited to be rescued. He had a clear lead, and a triumphant victory seemed all but assured. But then the unthinkable happened. As Marcus made his final push for the top of the wall, his foot slipped. He dangled precariously from a single handhold, his face a mask of shocked panic. He grunted with effort, but his strength was failing him. The crowd gasped, their murmurs turning to a low collective murmur of disbelief. The victory that had seemed so certain was now in jeopardy. This was Ayanna's moment. The breathless moment. She was still far behind her body, screaming with a pain that was both physical and emotional. The clock was ticking, a relentless metronome of her impending defeat. The announcer, a professional hype man, declared her out of time. Sterling, his face a mask of furious disbelief, shouted something inaudible from the VIP platform. Everything seemed lost. The ghost of her past, the woman who had always been able to get the job done, seemed to have finally failed. But then something shifted within her. Ayanna, her body a trembling mess of pain and exhaustion, looked up at the wall. She saw not a climbing wall, but a crumbling building in a foreign land. She saw not a dummy, but a fallen comrade, a brother in arms who was counting on her to save him. Ayanna closed her eyes, and a flash of memory so vivid it was almost real bloomed in her mind. The roar of a Pavehawk helicopter, the smell of burnt earth and blood, the frantic face of her medic working on her injured arm. She saw the faces of her team, their unyielding resolve, their shared promise to never leave anyone behind. That promise was her strength. That resolve was her fuel. That pain was her purpose. Ayanna, her eyes now open and burning with a fierce, unwavering light, took a deep breath. She reached out not with the brute force of a young man, but with the measured, precise movements of a true professional. She found a handhold that Marcus had missed, a small, insignificant crevice that only a veteran of countless real-life rescues would have seen. She moved with a silent, purposeful grace, her body now a tool of her indomitable will. She was not a brute. She was an artist, and the wall was her canvas. She climbed not with the athletic arrogance of Marcus, but with the quiet, focused intensity of a person fighting for their life. The crowd, which had been silent with shock, now began to murmur. They saw her movements so different from Marcus's frenetic energy. They saw the way her body worked in perfect harmony, a testament to a skill born not of training alone, but of 1,000 life-and-death situations. As she climbed her scarred arm, once a symbol of her weakness, was now a badge of her strength. She reached the top of the wall, her arm throbbing with a fire that threatened to consume her, but she did not falter. With a final agonizing push, she pulled herself over the top. She reached for the dummy, her hands steady and sure, unclipped it from the wall, and with a swift, practiced motion secured it to her harness. The crowd watched in stunned silence as Ayanna, her face a mask of pure, unadulterated resolve, began her descent. She moved with the silent, purposeful grace of a seasoned veteran, her body now a tool of her indomitable will. She hit the ground, and as her feet touched the earth, the timer on the scoreboard, which had been counting down to her defeat, hit 0, and a new number, an impossible time, flashed onto the screen. She had not only beaten Marcus, she had beaten the clock, and she had done it with a style and a grace that transcended the simple parameters of the competition. The silence, which had been a suffocating blanket, was suddenly and violently shattered by a deafening roar. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated catharsis. The crowd, which had come to see a spectacle, had just witnessed a miracle. The faces of the people Ayanna had served, the quiet, cynical patrons from the diner, the indifferent cook, even the young mother, were now a canvas of unadulterated awe. They saw not a waitress, but a hero. Their applause, a thunderous rhythmic roar, was a sound of collective vindication, a sound that finally drowned out the ghost of her past. Sterling on the VIP platform, his face a contorted mask of pure, unadulterated horror, watched his world crumble. His carefully laid plans, his malicious design for her public humiliation, had backfired in the most spectacular way possible. He had meant to expose her weakness, but he had inadvertently exposed her immense strength. He had intended to bury her, but he had instead unearthed a hero. He had become a joke, a petty bully, who had been put in his place by the very woman he had sought to destroy. His victory, which had seemed so certain, had turned into a humiliating defeat. Marcus Thorne, standing beside him, his face pale with shock and humiliation, could only stare at Ayanna. He had been so arrogant, so confident in his victory. He had underestimated her not as a woman, but as a warrior. He had seen a waitress, a broken veteran, and he had been defeated by a force of nature. A person whose resolve was forged in a far more brutal crucible than any training course he had ever been on. Sam, however, did not roar or clap. He simply stood there, a quiet, knowing smile on his face. His eyes, those faded blue eyes that had seen so much, now filled with a deep, profound sense of pride. He had believed in her not because of what she could do, but because of who she was. He was her personal vindication, her one-man army of support, and in that moment, as she stood there, a beacon of strength and defiance in the center of the arena, he knew that she had finally come home. Ayanna, exhausted and in pain but victorious, looked out at the sea of cheering faces, and for the first time in years she felt not dread or fear but a profound sense of peace. The applause was a sound of her freedom, a sound that finally drowned out the ghost of her past. She had reclaimed her honor in the most public and definitive way possible, and in doing so, she had reclaimed herself. The roar of the crowd, a sound that had once been a distant, abstract concept to Ayanna, now enveloped her. It was a physical force, a tidal wave of vindication that washed over her, drowning out the lingering echoes of her fear and self-doubt. As she stood in the center of the arena, exhausted and trembling, she looked not at the cameras or the massive scoreboard, but at the faces in the crowd. She saw the young mother, her eyes brimming with tears, giving her a slow, reverent nod. She saw the apathetic cook from the diner, his mouth agape with stunned admiration. She saw the faces of the regulars, a community that had once seen her as an invisible part of their lives, now looking at her as a hero. The applause was not just for her victory, it was for her story, a testament to the raw, unyielding power of a person who refused to be broken. On the VIP platform, Sterling's world was collapsing around him with a sickening inevitability. His smug, triumphant smile had been replaced by a mask of impotent rage and disbelief. The cameras, once his most trusted tools for crafting his public image, were now his worst enemies. They had captured every moment of his humiliation, the fall of his hired gun, and the defiant victory of the woman he had sought to destroy. His Veterans Valor Games, an event he had engineered to be a public display of his own power, And a weapon against Ayanna had become a public execution of his own reputation. He had not just lost a competition, he had lost the narrative. In the days that followed, the video of the race went viral, a testament to Ayanna's courage and an indictment of Sterling's cruelty. The public, a fickle and unforgiving jury, turned on him with a righteous fury. His carefully constructed image as a benevolent philanthropist crumbled. Replaced by the truth, he was a petty, vindictive bully. The ensuing public scrutiny led to a full-scale legal investigation into his business practices, a slow-moving but relentless machine that Ayanna knew would ultimately tear his empire apart. He lost contracts, his business partners abandoned him, and the very community he had sought to dominate turned its back on him. His downfall, a perfect and poetic justice, was not just a professional one. It was a social and personal ruin of his own making. Meanwhile, on the edge of the arena, Marcus Thorne stood, his face a canvas of profound shame. He had been so arrogant, so confident in his victory, so certain that he was the superior athlete. He had seen Ayanna as an easy paycheck, a washed-up veteran he could easily humiliate. But now, as he watched her in the center of the cheering crowd, he saw her for what she truly was, a professional, a warrior, and a hero. The victory had not been a matter of brute force or physical prowess. It had been a matter of will, of heart, of a quiet, unyielding resolve that he, for all his youth and strength, could never hope to possess. He knew in that moment that he had not just been defeated. He had been humbled. He walked over to Ayanna, his head bowed, a look of genuine remorse on his face. He extended a hand, not in an act of sportsmanship, but in a gesture of profound respect. "I owe you an apology," he said, his voice low and sincere. "I didn't see you. I just saw a paycheck. I was wrong. You're a hero." He looked at her arm, at the jagged scar that had been his target, and saw it now not as a sign of weakness, but as a badge of courage. "I don't deserve this, but the prize money, I want you to have it. Every single penny. It's the least I can do." Ayanna, her heart softening, simply nodded. She saw in his eyes not arrogance, but a raw, unburdened humanity. He was not a villain, but a man who had been misguided, a man who in his own way had been just as lost as she had been. In the days that followed, Ayanna's life, once a quiet, monotonous routine, was now a whirlwind of interviews and public appearances. The woman who had sought anonymity now found herself a local celebrity, a symbol of hope and defiance. But the most significant change came in the form of a phone call. It was from a National Veterans Foundation, a prestigious organization dedicated to helping veterans transition back to civilian life. They had seen her story, had been inspired by her quiet courage, and they had an offer for her. The job was not a simple desk job or a position as a physical trainer. It was a leadership role, a position as the head of a new program designed to help injured veterans use their skills in non-combat situations. They wanted her to be the face of the program, to use her story, her training and her experience to inspire and guide a new generation of soldiers who were struggling to find their way home. It was a perfect, poetic kind of justice, a new purpose that allowed her to use her past, not as a burden, but as a tool for a greater good. It was a new life, a life built not on hiding, but on a profound, unyielding sense of purpose. It was the life she had always been meant to live. Later that evening, in the quiet sanctuary of her home, Ayanna sat with Sam, nursing a cup of tea. He looked at her, his eyes, those faded blue eyes, filled with a quiet, paternal pride. "You know you could have just walked away," he said, his voice a low, gravelly murmur. "You could have just let him win, and nobody would have blamed you." Ayanna smiled, a gentle, tired smile that reached her eyes. "I know," she said quietly, "but then I would have been living in a lie. I would have been hiding from myself. And a person who hides from themselves, they're not really living. They're just a ghost." She looked down at her arm, at the jagged scar that had once been a source of so much shame and pain. It no longer felt like a wound. It felt like a badge of honor, a story that she was no longer afraid to tell. "I didn't do it alone," she said, her voice filled with a genuine, heartfelt gratitude. "I had you. You were the one who saw me when no one else did. You were the one who gave me the courage to fight." Sam, with a quiet, knowing nod, simply raised his teacup in a silent toast. "We all have our scars, Ayanna. Some you can see, some you can't. But they're what make us who we are. They're what make us strong. Ayanna, sitting there in the quiet comfort of her home, no longer felt like a ghost. She felt like a survivor, a hero, a person who had fought her way through a war and had finally at long last come home. Her journey of redemption had been a difficult one, a journey from a life of anonymity to a life of purpose. She had a new job, a new community, and a new sense of self. The woman who had once hid in the shadows of a diner was now stepping into the light, ready to begin her next chapter. A chapter of hope, of purpose, and of a profound, unyielding sense of peace. 1 year later, the rhythm of Ayanna's life was no longer a slow, mournful blues, but a vibrant, hopeful symphony. The clatter of mismatched cutlery and the hiss of the coffee machine had been replaced by the quiet hum of a bustling office, the purposeful chatter of a team united by a common cause. Her uniform was no longer a waitress's apron, but a sharp professional suit, a new kind of armor for a new kind of battle. The corner griddle was now a distant memory, a ghost of a life she had once inhabited, but it was not a memory she was ashamed of. It was the place where her old life had ended and her new one had begun. Ayanna, now the director of the Veterans Reintegration Program at the National Veterans Foundation, was a beacon of hope for countless men and women who had come home from the battlefield and were struggling to find their way. Her office, once an abstract concept in her quiet life, was a space filled with light and purpose. The walls were adorned not with faded menus, but with photos of the veterans her program had helped: a young Marine who had found a new career as a welder, a female pilot who was now a flight instructor, a soldier who had found his calling as a motivational speaker. These were the trophies of her new life, a testament to her courage and her capacity for compassion. The paying it forward action, once a small, anonymous act of kindness, had become the very foundation of her existence. One afternoon, Ayanna sat with a young veteran named Michael, a man whose eyes held the same kind of haunted, distant look that had once defined her own. He had come home from a deployment, his body intact, but his spirit shattered, a man who felt like a ghost in his own life. He had a profound sense of worthlessness, a feeling that his skills forged in the brutal crucible of war had no place in the civilian world. Ayanna, with a quiet, knowing empathy, listened to him, her heart aching with a shared understanding. "I know what it feels like," she said, her voice a soft, unwavering murmur. "To feel like you've lost your purpose. To feel like the world has no use for the person you had to become to survive." She paused, and with a deliberate, unhurried motion she rolled up the sleeve of her suit jacket. The scar, a thick, jagged seam that ran from her wrist to her elbow, was no longer a source of shame. It was a story, a testament, a tool. "This is a map of a place I once was," she said, her voice filled not with pain but with a profound, unyielding pride. "It's a reminder of a wound that healed a battle I won and a promise I made to myself. Your scars, whether they're on your body or in your heart, they're not a sign of your weakness. They're a sign of your strength. They're a story you're now here to tell." Michael, his eyes wide with a stunned reverence, looked at her, and for the first time, Ayanna saw in his eyes not a man who was lost, but a man who was beginning to find his way. Her words, her story, her courage had given him the gift of hope, a fragile but powerful thing. She was not just a program director. She was a rescuer, a guardian angel, a force for good. She was herself again in a way she had never thought possible. The omniscient perspective, a privilege of the narrative, now offered a final glimpse into the fates of the other key players in her story. Sterling, the man who had sought to destroy her, was a shadow of his former self. His business empire, built on a foundation of greed and manipulation, had been torn apart by a relentless legal investigation. He was no longer a man of power or influence, but a footnote in a story of public disgrace. His arrogance, once a weapon he wielded with impunity, was now a source of ridicule. He was a man who had lost everything, a fitting and poetic justice for a man who had tried to take everything from others. Marcus Thorne, the young and arrogant soldier who had been hired to humiliate her, had found his own path to redemption. Humbled by his defeat and inspired by Ayanna's quiet strength, he had become a vocal advocate for the Veterans Foundation. He now served as a mentor in Ayanna's program, his youthful arrogance replaced by a profound sense of purpose. He was a Type B character who in his own way had been saved by Ayanna's courage, and he was now paying that kindness forward. And Sam, the quiet, knowing veteran who had been her one-man army of support, was a constant, steady presence in her life. He was no longer just a friend. He was family. He would often come to her office not for business, but for quiet conversation. One afternoon, he sat across from her, a content smile on his face. His faded blue eyes filled with a deep paternal pride. "You've come a long way from the diner," he said, his voice a low, gravelly murmur. Ayanna smiled, a radiant, genuine smile that reached her eyes. "I know," she said quietly, "but I wouldn't be here if it wasn't for that diner. I wouldn't be here if I hadn't been a waitress. I wouldn't be here if I hadn't been forced to stand up for myself, to fight for who I am." She looked at her arm, at the jagged scar, a map of a battlefield, and a reminder of a wound that had healed. It was a reminder of a life she had lost, and a life she had gained. "I used to think that my scar was a mark of shame," she said, her voice filled with a profound sense of peace. "I used to think it was a sign of a broken life. But now I know that it's a mark of courage. It's a reminder that I survived, that I healed, that I came home." Ayanna's life was now a testament to the power of courage, a life built not on anonymity and fear, but on a profound, unyielding sense of purpose. She had come home not to a place, but to herself. Her journey, which had started in a quiet, anonymous diner, had ended in a place of light and purpose. She had found her way back to who she was: a protector, a rescuer, a hero, and in doing so, she had become a beacon for all those who were still lost in the dark. The ghost of her past was gone, replaced by a radiant living presence, a woman who had fought her way through a war and had finally, at long last, come home. The sun, a buttery gold, streamed through the window of her office, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air, a silent, beautiful symphony of a life renewed. If this story stirred your heart, if it reminds you that courage can alter destinies, and that light always finds a path, even in the deepest darkness, please leave a comment. Share this story with those who need inspiration. Like, subscribe, and hit the bell to never miss our upcoming stories.